Cindy. So more on the Jean and Silme case. We will now call on Bruce Occena.
Welcome. Thank you for having us here today. I appreciate that. I will shift the topic a little bit. My charge is to try to answer the question of what was the approach that the KDP took to its work that might help give a context for this case. How did this case happen and what took place? How did the KDP operate? So I will try to do this within a few minutes. I've never been known to say anything in less than 5 minutes, but I'll try. I think that I want to start by saying that Dr. Nomenzo is one of my mentors, and I'm glad to be here with him today. He was the person who told me I better get back to school and get some credentials. I was a middle-aged ex-activist with a high school diploma, and so I had to follow that advice. Thank you today. He also mentioned Walden, and I see Joe Rocamora and Dean, and there's a number of our comrades who were in the KDP in the United States and are now here in the Philippines, doing a wide range of work. So certainly I want to make sure people understand that many of our KDP activists are actually back here in the Philippines and continuing whatever work they have in front of them. So I just need that water. I agree with Dedong. I think that so long as the struggle in the Philippines is incomplete, and many of us in this room have thought that we were almost there, and then it slipped out of our fingers, and we tried again and thought it was almost there, and it slipped out of our fingers. But surely the struggle for democracy and justice in the Philippines is far from over. And because of that, the relation of the struggle in the Philippines to the overseas Filipino community is crucial. And I'm going to try to talk a little bit about that link. And I agree with Dedong that probably there is certainly a need for a new version, a new and improved version of the KDP. It would have to be very different for no other reason that it's nice to see many young people in the room, but most of us who were in the KDP are growing older. So for no other reason, whatever the new form of support for the Philippine struggle, it would have to be different. We simply don't have the energy we had when we were in our 20s. But there are a lot of very interested young Filipino-Americans who are extremely interested in the situation in the Philippines. So I think there is some lessons, or there are some lessons about what the KDP was and what was the approach we took to the work that explains this case, how this case happened. So I'm going to start from a story that took place before the KDP formed. Along with aging, I'm a diabetic, so I have to drink water. A few years before the KDP formed, there was a meeting of about 7 or 8 dispersed Filipino collectives that had spontaneously formed in different places in the United States. Some were from New York and Chicago and Philadelphia and along this California coast. There were meetings. So these collectives were meeting to try to figure out how could the overseas community in the Philippines support the struggle for democracy, national democracy in the Philippines. So this is right after the first quarter storm, and the whole of Philippine society has been electrified by these political issues. So we were gathering, and we were a motley crew, trust me. These were small collectives, very different from each other, and we're in the mountains of Santa Cruz trying to figure out what the hell we would do. And we really were young and inexperienced and didn't have much of an idea. The day before we were to disperse, and now that the Marcos regime is gone, we can tell this story. The day before that group was dispersed, martial law was declared. And we were still convened. We were supposed to go home the next day. And so we changed our agenda, and we said, okay, so there's 7 collectives here. We go back to our respective cities, and we coordinate militant protest in front of the Philippine consulates in 2 days. Why I say this is because that fed the paranoia of the Marcos dictatorship. And the truth be told, it was accidental. We just happened to be together. But you can see how we appeared to the Marcos regime. Martial law is declared, and within 3 days, demonstrations across the country, coordinated demonstrations. That's important because in the next 15 years, we basically set about the difficult task of living up to that bluff. We had bluffed the Marcos regime, and then we worked really hard to live up to that bluff. And we're proud to say we did. So the KDP was able, over a 15-year period, to be a thorn in the side of the Marcos regime, a serious thorn. So just to give you some examples, foreign aid appropriations were lobbied and challenged and delayed. Every appropriation to the Philippine government was challenged. The attempts of the Marcoses to come and have a state visit, we blocked that for many, many years. And made it very difficult for the Marcoses to even come, even though the President of the United States was close friends with the Marcos family. We managed to delay that, and when they finally did come, we embarrassed them every place they went. So from the time they got off the plane, we basically managed to isolate and embarrass them. So I say that because that's the backdrop for some of the work Jean and Selmy were doing. In other words, it was work that we had been doing for 15 years. And we were never confused. That we always felt that the work in the overseas community was supportive and important, but not decisive. So we never were confused that somehow we would make a difference in terms of the Filipino struggle for democracy. That can only be done here in the Philippines. But we also understood that what we did do was significant and important, although not decisive. And so that is still the need today. There's a lot of important struggles, and the question of how do we link to the overseas communities effectively. So I want to just share a little bit about the approach the KDP had, because it was very different and it was a bit controversial. So one is we spent a lot of time trying to understand the particular nature of the Filipino community in the United States. And to look at the push-pull factors that establish overseas communities. So in the Philippines, even to today, the push factors are tremendous that push Filipinos to leave the country. And unfortunately, we can say that qualitatively has not changed. So the conditions that make up life seem like it has little opportunities and bring people to try to figure out how to leave the country in order to, for themselves, their families, their future. So those push factors are very strong. But it's the pull factors of the United States that really need to be highlighted. And we spent a lot of time trying to understand what makes the United States different. So some of it is historical. The colonial relationship is very important, which meant that the United States becomes a plausible place to go because we have a colonial relationship already. and there's a lot of cultural intermixture that makes the United States a top choice. Certainly if you have to compare the United States to Saudi Arabia, obviously there's all kinds of cultural reasons that would make the United States attractive. Secondly, and probably equally important, is it's the oldest Filipino overseas community and the largest. And as a result, it is a very complex sociology. There are we've stopped doing the careful study, probably more than 4 waves of Filipino immigrants over the last 100 years that have come to the United States. We spent a lot of time in KDP looking at each of those waves and trying to understand what was different about them. So we have pensionados who come at the turn of the century, basically for an education. Most of them return home. Then we have a wave of Filipino immigrants that come primarily from the peasantry, who were brought to the United States to be farmhands, work in the fisheries, work in the factories in the United States. And then in 1965 we have a big shift. The shift is that we start to attract Filipinos who are college educated and bilingual English. So you start to have the whole influx of Filipinos into the United States have a different sociology. They enter the United States at a different place. They have advantage over other immigrants. They speak English. They have an advantage over other immigrants. They're familiar with American culture. And they actually enter the job force at a higher level, so they do no longer enter as farmhands and factory. So we studied in the KDP each of those waves very carefully to try to understand how we would approach that work. So the other thing that the KDP did regularly, that this is our first opportunity in the Philippines to explain what we did, so that's why we're very excited. We had that broad framework, but the United States is a gigantic country. And so we also, every place we had a chapter, we did an annual review of the Filipino community in that area. In other words, we didn't assume that the Filipino community in New York was similar to the Filipino community in Hawaii. And every chapter of the KDP had to annually assess what does your community look like, and how do those waves of immigration look like in your area, and recognize that it would look different in another area. So I think that just as an introduction, I wanted to share that so people understand that we approach trying to understand the U.S. community in all its complexity as an overseas community. And we knew from the beginning that it was not the same overseas community as Filipino housekeepers in Italy, or Filipino construction workers in Saudi Arabia. We knew this community had a lot of complexity. The other thing is the interrelations between the different generations means that when a Filipino comes to the United States, there is actually a different pull, because there's relatives already there, or there's classmates who are there, there's people to help you with the transition. So the United States, in that sense, also deserves careful analysis. The third thing, which is has to do with American culture. Sometimes we're very anti-American, but the fact is, if I had to find one good thing to say about America, is it's the only country in the world that says that it will create its nation through people from other countries coming to it. So that's not what Germany says. That's not what Kuwait says. That's not what Saudi Arabia says. So the United States also has that cultural dynamic. All of these things are simply to say the KDP looks